to $500,000 in grants for eligible energy efficiency and resiliency investments in your municipal facilities. So this is a big opportunity for communities. Many of you have been digging into this deeply for a while. We recognize there's been some confusion with changes to the program, but we're here to sort of clarify things for everyone. Commissioner Fitch is going to talk through a little bit of that momentarily, but good news, the application deadline has been pushed back to September 27th. There's a lot to cover. Just high level, I'm going to turn it over, briefly to Buildings General Services, Commissioner Jennifer Fitch, going to sort of frame where we're at, the opportunity, what's been happening. And then Commissioner Fitch is going to turn it over to Brian Sewell, who's the State Energy Program Manager, who's going to sort of provide a slideshow, walk and talk through some of the details that are really important to you. And then we're going to have a Q&A session with Commissioner Fitch, Deputy Commissioner David DiBiase, and Brian. So we're going to hope to get to as many of your questions as possible. So if you have questions, please put those questions in the chat now or throughout the presentation. So we're going to capture those questions. Again, aim to get to as many of them today as possible, or we hope follow up if we run out of time. And then lastly, just as you know, this important program has been in partnership with the RPCs, Regional Planning Commissions, many of whom are represented here today. Thank you for all your work. Your RPC is an incredible resource for this program, so please ensure you're connected to them if you haven't been already. So I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Jennifer Fitch to sort of ground us, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation and then get to your questions. So thanks again for joining us. And Commissioner Fitch.
Thank you, Joey. That was a great introduction and synopsis of our program. So as many of you know, Act 172 was passed in 2022, and the intent of that program is to make municipal buildings more energy efficient and resilient. And we want to thank our program partners, like you said, Joey, before. We've been working really closely with the legislature, specifically Representative Sibilia. We've also been working really closely with Efficiency Vermont, all the regional planning commissions, the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. And it's been really great to work with all of you and all of our program partners. This program was divided into 4 segments. The first segment was $2.4 million to the regional planning commissions to provide technical assistance. The next round was up to $4,000 mini grants to really learn more about what does energy efficiency and resilience really mean when it comes to municipal buildings, and sort of educating communities. The next component, and the component that took the longest, was all the building assessments. So I want to say thank you to all of our program partners and the regional planning commissions, because they really got the word out about the program, and that's wonderful. We were requested to do over 500 building assessments throughout the state of Vermont, and those building assessments can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to do the physical assessment, and then it takes additional time to do the reporting. We had 4 consultants doing those assessments. We recognized that we needed to add additional resources. We put out another request for proposal. 2 additional consultants responded, and so we now have 6 consultants that are doing those assessments. So we've done everything we can do to speed up those assessments by adding additional resources, but we came to a point where, unfortunately, we were not able to get them all done. And in accordance with the bill, you have to have a conducted building assessment in order to be able to apply for the up to $500,000 implementation grants. And that brings us to today. So today we're really excited to talk to you about the applications for the implementation grants. And originally we had only opened it to the towns that were considered the high and highest energy burden per the 2019 Energy Burden Report from Efficiency Vermont, because it's required in the bill and because we knew we had some towns that we hadn't conducted assessments. So that's why we had only narrowed it down to those towns initially. But we heard from many of you that you're really excited about the program, and we believe it's a small enough number of towns that we're going to work with our consultants, and we're going to try to speed up those assessments so that they can still be done within this period, and all towns will be able, that had assessments, will be able to apply. So that's why we reopened it. In addition, our program partners really want to see what the full financial need is, because we do have $36 million, which is fantastic, but that likely won't be enough funding to meet the need. And so they also want to see the total need so that we can continue to strategize around other funding sources or future funding sources. So that's why We opened it to all. We think we can get to all those building assessments, and we want to see that total financial need. We do expect that the program is going to be overprescribed. And we expect that we won't be able to award grants to everyone. So just want to keep that eyes wide open. And when you look into the bill, it still does prioritize, again, those communities with the high and highest energy burden in that 2019 burden report. So when you look at the way that these will be scored, you'll see that those communities get additional points off of that one scoring criteria. There are a total of 6, and Brian will go through those today. Again, those all match what's in the bill. So please refer back to the bill. And then we only added one additional one, and that was really around return on investment. So we want to make sure that we're getting the most impactful investments from these grants. And so really we want to look at things like weatherization, for example, before we would look at something like an electrical vehicle charging station. We definitely want to support the rollout of electrical vehicles, absolutely 110%, but we want to make sure that we're ticking off those really value-added energy efficiency projects first. So you'll see that the last criteria that we added really comes around that return on investment component of the grants. And so again, we're really excited to be here. It's been a very long time to get here. This is really where the rubber is going to hit the road. And through this program, we're going to be able to reduce energy use, reduce those energy costs. We're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to increase comfort in municipal buildings. And so those are all wonderful outcomes of the program. And we're really excited to get to this part of the program. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Brian. Brian, you want to take it from here with the presentation?
Thank you, Commissioner Fitch. Good morning, good afternoon. Hopefully folks can hear me okay and can see the title slide. Okay, great. So my name is Brian Sewell. I'm the State Energy Program Manager with the Department of Buildings and General Services. Been working on the state buildings for a number of years now, and was really excited when we had the opportunity to extend some of these energy services to municipalities through the passage of Act 172. Thus creating MERP. So let's go through, obviously the biggest update this afternoon is that we are now opening the application to all eligible energy burden communities that have completed their energy assessments. These building assessments, basically, right, we had level 1, level 2. Those still are open to everybody who completed those to apply for the assessment. We want to make sure that folks understand when you go through the application, and we know from monitoring the intake form that there's a number of folks who've already applied, which is great, that we do ask for your budget per building, as well as attaching that assessment report. So some of the big highlights that the commissioner already teed up, application period will close on September 27th. Towns will be notified of awards the week of October 21st. So up until that point, we'll be going through our scoring and application review period. As the commissioner teed up, and again, I just want to make sure we're very clear and repeating this loudly and often, that scoring is going to be focused on those list of measures. We do cover everything up to those resilience components like EV charging, solar, on-site renewables. Again, because we want to make sure folks are able to switch off of fossil fuels, but we can't do that unless we've made sure the basics are covered. And so again, we know what happens when we put heat pumps and other types of equipment into a building that doesn't have insulation or proper weatherization and air sealing. Those pieces of equipment don't perform, they fail, and no one is happy. So we want to ensure that we do not go down that road. And that's why you see that being a critical component of our scoring. Grant agreements must be signed and returned by November 29th. We understand that this can be really challenging when the select boards meet monthly. We know that this might not line up with folks' schedule perfectly. We also understand that a lot of people just got their reports. And so, we're hoping maybe for a month to review and then another month to think about it and apply. Unfortunately, as you heard Commissioner Fitch mention, we just do not have that time within this program. It's a lot of money to get out the door. We're excited to do really exceptional work on helping municipalities on energy resilience. So we will be working with our partners at the regional planning commissions and municipal staff to ensure that folks get through this application and grant award period by November 29th. I'm going to keep saying it. Our grant specialist, Megan Fuller, will also be reminding folks to make sure that we get those agreements signed and returned by that date. One of the things that we're really excited about with this new application form being hosted by JotForm, one is that many of you might already be familiar with this platform from applying with the bond bank's municipal application. Some of the feedback that we received through the first 2 rounds, which the commissioner mentioned, mini grants and the assessments, is that we ran into some file size restrictions. There were other components of being able to save and return to your application that we really needed to go beyond the state's license with Microsoft Forms to achieve those goals. We're really pleased that we were able to get this set up through JotForm, find a solution that didn't break the bank, but allowed people to attach any file size, multiple types of files, to save and return to your work, and to continue to allow regional planning commission staff to support those municipalities that needed the extra help in getting the applications in. So no surprise here that this program from its inception and the passage of Act 172 is really focused on supporting those municipalities that sometimes struggle with staffing capacity. You're wearing 6 hats, maybe as a town clerk, or other town administrator, and being told that now you have to do all of this on your own. We heard that feedback, the legislature heard that feedback, and throughout this process, the program's been designed around supporting those municipalities. So we'll talk about this on the next slide, but we'll get into why having authorized representative and RPC assistance throughout this program has been so critical. But then ensuring also that the application form is addressed back to the town. So with this, we know that many of you applied for multiple buildings to be assessed. That's great. Again, the award cap is still $500,000 per applicant. So in a lot of these cases, we're going to be able to do work across multiple buildings, which is excellent. The way we address that within this application form is to make sure that you can apply for multiple buildings. So each assessment should cover a specific building, and you're going to go through and you're going to put your information for each building budget, and the application will total that at the end. One of the things that was adjusted throughout the course of the program was allowing for ADA costs to cover some of that accessibility in the building to make sure buildings are compliant. It also includes soft costs, clerking, A&E design work, things like that. We heard from a lot of folks that that was going to be an issue in moving forward with the project, so this helps give a little buffer. The application form also builds in an automatic 10% contingency. That's on every building budget. So again, I think a lot of safeguards have been built in from the administration and the work of Commissioner Fitch and Deputy Commissioner DiBiase to try and support some of these concerns and feedback that we received from everybody over the last 8 months to a year. So again, just to be clear, those adders are, we're asking you to look at what your soft costs might be and what the ADA might be, add it to the estimated budget from the assessment report, and then that 10% line, that is going to be calculated automatically. So you don't have to worry about doing that. The application is going to do it for you as you go through. So with that, we know that there have been a lot of updates coming out from the administration. I'm sure there are questions, and so perhaps we can move now into the Q&A phase of the webinar. We know VECAN has been tracking people's questions in the chat, and hopefully we can provide a little more clarification today. So with that, I want to open it up to taking questions.
Thanks, Brian. There are a lot of questions related to the fact that, some towns just haven't gotten their reports. So that dynamic of timing, which is really challenging, as Sam Lash said, Central Vermont waiting on 15 reports. I mean, how do towns grapple with not having that information that they need? What do you specifically, some specific questions related to that? What if you don't receive your energy audit in time to finish the application by the 27th of September? Can you speak to that, like that dynamic and how towns can and should grapple with that?
Sure. So as the commissioner mentioned at the top of the webinar, we know that there was an incredible amount of interest in the assessment phase of the program. over 600 buildings applied for, over 500 approved for assessments. We added additional vendors. This was just a tremendous amount of buildings to try and get through, something at scale that I do not have a comparison to make within recent memory in the state. So I should say organized through a state program like this. For those folks who are in that last group that is getting scheduled at the moment, you heard Commissioner Fitch mention this at the beginning. Unfortunately, there is no way that timing will work for a September 27th application period close. There is a second component to the program that we will be looking at next year for the municipal loans. Right now, as we mentioned, we're really focused on getting these $36 million in grant funding out the door. So, we understand the situation that puts those communities in, and we would encourage them to come back and apply for the loan program. For the folks who already have their site visit completed and are just waiting for either updates to their report, either because they had feedback or they're just waiting for the report to come through, we have been giving updates to the vendors on the timeline of the program, and have told them that they must be delivering these reports as quickly as possible, and certainly before the period closes. The last couple that we are aware of should be
can I
delivered
insert there
by
real quick?
Sorry? Yep.
Can I insert on that one real quick before we get too far ahead? So just for clarification, and as Brian said, this has been pretty fluid in lots of decisions to open it up to everybody, which we're excited about doing. So as long as you have an assessment completed by the end of the application, the end of the date that we need assessments signed by, or not assessments, grant to meet agreements out the door and scoring done, we can and I have to look at that date, and maybe Commissioner Fitch, you've got that in front of you. I'm looking at the chat here. So as long as those things are in your hand at that point, we know that's not helpful to create your budget because those are really supposed to be there. But as trying to open this up for everybody to be able to put the applications in and have a shot at this, all communities that don't have them, as long as they've received an assessment by the close, we will take and score those applications as such. So everybody can put in, no matter, as long as you've got an assessment. Even as of not today or September, I think it was October at some point. And I don't know, Brian or Jennifer.
October, it's October 18th. And the other thing is what I also understand, Brian, is they may not have their completed report, but in theory, they have their executive summary. Many of them have their executive summaries and they have their cost tables. They may not have the completed report. So they have the nuts and bolts of what they need. The other thing that I forgot to mention, and I apologize to everything, the other thing that's really driving the timeline, right, is that this is ARPA funding. In addition to that, there's timelines listed in the bill. So as a result of that, so the two things that drove the timeline, right? Think about those assessments taking longer than we had planned, even though we had increased our resources, right? And you're hitting an ARPA deadline, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to make this program be as open and as eligible to as many communities as possible. And we knew that when we opened it up and expanded it out to everyone that will have a conducted assessment, that we were going to have this sort of crunch. And we considered that, right? So the pros and cons were we leave it the way that it is, or we open it to all, because the other goal was to fully subscribe the funding. And according to the RPCs, with it only being open to high and highest, we weren't going to be able to fully subscribe what's available for funding. So we're doing the best job we can. We recognize it's not ideal, and we're going to work as quickly as we can for those communities, which there's only a few that have not had a conducted assessment, to get them all done within this period, so that in theory, anybody that asked for an assessment or was awarded an assessment will be able to apply. The grant, when we're going to start notifying people, is going to be around October 18th. So that's the date right now that we have for starting to let folks know that you have been awarded a grant. And so that is going to allow for that timeline to be able to have all the conducted assessments. And so in theory, everybody should be able to apply. If you don't have numbers right now, so you don't know what to ask for, what I would say is, and I know this is tough, but working with the RPCs, put in a number, right, in your application. So at least you have an application in. And then we can address those communities that don't have their executive summaries and their cost tables. And we're going to work hand in hand with you along with your RPC partner. So I know it's not ideal, but we're trying to do the best job we can to open this up to as many towns as possible. So just keep that in mind. Thank you.
I want to touch, as Commissioner Fitch just said, and we want to make this, when it comes to the budget line items, the reason that we went this way, and there's a lot of different ways to roll out grants, right? A lot of times it's, we need some quotes, we need to see some numbers. We know the timeline's short. It was always short, even without this ARPA time frame kind of moving on us a little bit. So these are the best that you guys can do. And I see a lot of a lot of questions in the chat about this. So if it's $8,000 for the furnace, but the supplier in the assessment report, but you know that your contractor locally says it's going to cost you $12,000 because that's just materials and labor and all the other pieces. They've got to replace this other thing that goes along with the thing, but that wasn't part of your energy assessment. That's why they're budget numbers. So we want to make sure that if you assign a budget, you can do the best job that you can to get the work done that you're asking for. Relevant to that on the other side is we've seen a lot of questions about, if I describe this work in the assessment or in the application and I don't get it all done, or we don't have enough money, are we kind of out of the loop, or is the money coming back? Again, I think as long as the projects are still close to the ideals in the description that you provided and they haven't drastically changed, the budget is just that. It's a budget, and we're going to try to do the best we can. BGS is going to be a partner in that process. So you get your assessment, or you get your quotes back from vendors, and they're much different. And you're like, oh my gosh, this is what we were hoping to do. We can't get it done under this price, but we really still think we can get a lot of good work done. That's going to be a iterative conversation with BGS, but the intent is to get as much money out the door to do good work in these buildings as we can. So budget numbers are just that. They're budget numbers. Put the best numbers that you can in there. It's also why we kind of put some escalation as a requirement into the applications, because our BGS and that's all what we do is buildings every day, and we know the numbers are crazy and they come in all over the place. So we wanted to make sure you guys had a little bit of a cushion if things run a little high. So hopefully that answers a couple of different questions that we've seen through the chat.
I'm going to ask a related question, then we're trying to keep questions just in the chat, but maybe we can get to you, Sam. One question that a couple of people asked that seems a little bit related. If listed items more than $500,000, or do you want the full project in the application, or do you only want it to fit inside the limit?
So yeah, in the budget boxes, as Brian showed, please you list your budget for the MERP.
Yeah.
In the narrative, I would say describe the entire project, right? Hey, we're going to do this $1 million thing. We've already got $480,000 in there from, community efforts, or maybe you don't. We would like to see projects that are not, I would say, waiting for additional funding to be completed, because there is some time frame to get. There's the obligation part, right? Like we talked about, that's kind of pushing today's conversation. But then we've also got to close these things out in a couple of years. And if towns are still fundraising for a bigger, broader project, it may be a little harder to fund those projects. Not to say we wouldn't, right? But it's not shovel ready. It's more about how can we spend the money in the next year and a half, 2 years, and not leave it sitting there waiting for additional funds to be expended. But so I would say explain that in the narrative section under the budget items. But as far as the budget goes and the numbers that you're going to see, please just fill in what you're requesting from the MERP program itself.
Okay. Hey, Brian,
And
do you
Deputy
mind,
Commissioner DBA, sorry, I just wanted to address the narrative box briefly. So this is also something that was new for this, and it was really important for us to include it because we talked with a number of communities and received feedback from even more, that for a lot of these folks, right, there are town assets, town buildings that are currently underutilized for potentially a number of reasons. And communities had really great ideas on how they could make that space more functional for their town citizens going forward, right? If that was going to become a new opportunity for a shelter, there are co-benefits here that we're aware of that can be applied to health and long-term resilience, and in all of the ways that word applies to Vermont's health and wellness in its communities. So adding that narrative was really key for us, even though it can make it a little bit harder than just having set number fields. Being able to let towns tell us, this is what we're looking to utilize that space for, as Deputy Commissioner DiBiase mentioned, that is your space to kind of help us understand what this assessment and what this work will allow the town to do and how it relates to the overall energy resilience goals. And we're really excited to see all the ways that communities are being creative for utilizing space that maybe right now is not able to fit that need because the building isn't, hasn't been upgraded the way it needs to be. So we were excited about that.
And I think in that same sense, right, the one that we use a lot is, if I'm a town and I think I can get 8 windows replaced or this much weather sealing done for this much money. But then, you know what? Our community came together. We've got a guy who's really handy. It only costs us this much money, but we can get 12 windows done for the same amount of money. We want that to happen, right? Like, we don't want to restrict you guys to that 6 windows because that's the best information you had at the time. We want to be able to have that flexibility to get as much done in that time period using whatever resources, and Vermont's very resourceful, right, in our communities to make sure we try to make this money go as far as it possibly can.
There are many questions. Some vendors included contingency in their estimates and some didn't. How will you adjust for that?
That's an interesting question. I would say that there's never enough contingency. Just to be honest with you, BGS typically on our construction projects carry 20% contingency. I think we carried 10, right? Is that where we landed? We carried 10, so it's a little low. I think it's about what your projects and the money that you have in front of you for budgets really end up at. So if you're running short on money and there's some contingency in there, we are not holding people to the assessment values, right? So the assessment said it's $5,000 and then they kept a $500 contingency on there as well. We're not sitting here saying you can only spend $5,500. So I think it's how it works for your town. I haven't seen all of the reports because there's many of them, but we would not, you can include it or not include it. I think that's up to the town and the risk that you're willing to take about either having enough money or not enough money with the 10% that BGS is kind of mandating that is kept for contingency.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. So questions related to if it looks like 20% for ADA cost is per building, if one building needs only to spend 10% of their total on ADA improvements, and another building in the same town needs to spend 30%, as long as the ADA total for all the buildings in that town is less than 20%, is that allowed?
So the way that ADA works, and this was another negotiation we had with our friends at Fire Safety and making sure that we were being compliant with the bill language, is the bill language says must be ADA compliant. So if your building's already ADA compliant, you don't have to spend any money on it. Or if it needs one handrail and that's $500, that's all you need to spend. You don't need to spend 20%. The alternative is that if you can't spend enough in the program to get it ADA compliant, we at least now need to put 20% of the building, and it is building, it'll be building centric because that's how it's worded, right? The buildings need to be ADA compliant towards that building itself. But again, it don't need to spend 20% if your building doesn't need any ADA upgrades, or it only needs a little. As long as it becomes ADA compliant through the program or spends 20% of the project budget, then that will that'll check both of those boxes for the state and the feds.
Great. Okay. Let's see, question about concern about space given in the narrative section. Are we expected to provide general description of building value to the community or detail the budget items as suggested in the application?
That's your space to sell it. So
Okay.
I would do descriptive of each budget line, and then I would sell your project to the state, right? There's not, the intent of, as Brian said about the applications, is really to keep this simple, knowing that many towns don't have resources or many people that are going to spend weeks and weeks and weeks putting together. Some of these applications for grants are not fun to fill out, as I'm sure many of you guys are aware of. So we left that box there, but that is your space. I would say that's your really the important space for you. That box expands, right? It keeps going, Brian, to sell and tell your story, show the picture, describe the each line item so that we understand kind of what you're doing with the money. But also to Brian's point, hey, this is a building that's been highly underutilized through the years. Through COVID, we found that this would have been a great space for us to be able to access and provide these services or anything else under the sun, that why this is a great project to fund by BGS.
And I think to echo a point the Deputy Commissioner was making earlier that ties in with this, you know, when we went out to hire these contractors to do the assessments, you know, we followed our same standard that we would for state buildings. And that's really their specialty, right? They're designed to work on what is the current space, what does it look like, how can it be improved? And what was part of the process flow over the last year while we started the assessment phases, we began to hear from towns, and I know from being in places like Hyde Park Village and Hyde Park Town and going out and doing some checks on our own, like I mentioned earlier, there's folks who say, well, this is how the building looks right now, but this is what it could do to provide us with better energy resilience if we can kind of utilize this space in this new way. And I know folks were saying, well, that might not be captured the way we want it to be told in the assessment report, because again, that's not what these contractors are designed to do. They're not assessing the current building and trying to extrapolate to what the town could use it for. Their job is to assess the structure and make recommendations to make it better. It doesn't really translate the same way that you and your community have really been thinking about this space day in and day out, month after month, year after year. So this is also a time for you to, you've got your numbers in the actual table. This is a chance, as the deputy commissioner said, to kind of sell that project, tell us how that fits in with the energy resilience goals in a way that, maybe you thought wasn't going to be captured in a strict assessment report.
Okay. Hey, just process wise, we are capturing, as Dan said, all of these questions and an Excel sheet. Question for the BGS team, can we follow up with any of these later? And then I don't know if like anyone on the BGS team, Grace or others, can answer some of these that seem pretty straightforward. Just directly in the chat. We can also capture the chat and share the chat later.
Yeah.
So
Joey, I think there's a couple there as I'm reading through your spreadsheet that will just hammer out real quick.
yeah,
So
hammer away, David. You
do
take
your
the
towns have
floor.
with our completed reports? Do towns with our completed report need to adhere to the recommendations? This would seem to be constrained if some towns can apply without having reports. So perfect is not going to be had here. So we would like towns that have had assessments, because that's the basis for this, to utilize their assessments to prioritize the requests. As the bill language states, it's to be prioritized in a certain order. So as it spoke about earlier, EV, battery storage, vehicle charging are on the low end. So if you're applying for battery storage, but the assessment said that you have your building looks like Swiss cheese and the air flows out of it every time you open a door, it's not going to be prioritized because that's not the best use of that funding. The towns that don't have them, unfortunately, that's not their fault, right? That's just the fault of the system not being able to do enough assessments in a short amount of time, as much as we tried really, really hard to add some more into the mix as well. So yes, please use your assessments to prioritize the ask. Not to say you have to do that, but I would say that the scoring metrics does favor, and the bill does prioritize towns to kind of utilize certain pieces like the insulation, air sealing, fossil fuel switching as really the priority of this bill and the funding that is going out the door. MERP funds for matching these are state revenue replacement funds, so they can be stacked with other funds. It'll probably be dependent on the actual funds that you're trying to match and whatever regulations are around them, but they are considered state dollars is how they are considered. Our humidity controls measured eligible for funding. Again, this comes back to the intent of the bill was towards fuel switching, right? So we're trying to get away from the fossil fuels. We're trying to switch to energy efficient products. There is some language in the bill that does speak to if for whatever reason you have to stick with a fossil fuel, there has to be some proving to that. So in your application, if you're one of these towns that for some reason just needs to upgrade, you need to update the boiler. It's still fossil fuel switching, but it's a much more efficient one. Maybe it's because the energy service in your area doesn't support that, or the project would be much too large to be funded. Those are eligible. They just need to be explained as to why we're staying on fossil fuels as opposed to switching to a renewable source. Shovel ready. This is not a shovel ready. I think I mentioned that. This is not shovel ready projects. They do not need to be shovel ready to be eligible for funding. It would be helpful because we know the money will get out the door by the end of the time that we need them to kind of close up, but they are not required to be shovel ready. Is replacing an old elevator ADA expense? If it's not ADA compliant, then yes. If it's compliant and you just want to replace it because you want a shiny new one, no. So again, it's coming back to making buildings compliant. Buildings that aren't open to the public, again, in that ADA sense, sewer and water facilities do not have the same requirement of ADA compliance for what they're required to have. So they're still required to be compliant, but compliant to the type of structure and usage that is required for a sewer and water treatment facility. So many of those do not have ADA requirements or access requirements for their staff because they fall under a different determination as a building. And that again goes back to that soft cost kind of block in the application for funding. So that's where you guys are going to look to say, man, I need an expert, because BGS uses a lot of experts, and we know a lot of times we have to call an engineer and say, hey, Mr. Engineer, Mrs. Engineer, I don't know what to do to make this building ADA compliant. Can you tell me? And they may come back and say, oh, well, Dave, you don't need to make it ADA compliant. It's a sewer facility. It's expected that the type of work that is done here, it does not the persons that are using it have to be able to have accessibility to them on their own regard. So use that funding source to hire, or at least in theory, put your budget lines in to hire people if needed. If you don't need it, you don't have to ask for it. But if you need them because your projects are maybe a little more complex than just swapping a furnace, then that's the place to try to ask for some of that funding to help you guys along. What else is in there that's kind of trying to grab the theme?
There are a couple Deputy Commissioner questions related to solar.
Yeah, the net metering yeah. So I would say again, solar, low priority of the funding as a generality. Is it eligible? It is. I don't know much about the net metering question. I think that's far and away outside the scope of us. Not saying it doesn't qualify. I'm just going to say that it sounds like I saw in the chat somebody else referenced a new bill that came out that's not going to be applicable anyhow. So without getting in the minutia of that, I would just say that generally energy or solar projects are not going to be at the high end of the spectrum for funded projects. They are eligible and maybe they could be funded, but the fuel swapping, the energy efficiency of the buildings is going to be much more higher priority of the funding sources, as described in the bill. That's not from BGS's side.
Deputy Commissioner, I think this is also worth reiterating, because I know we mentioned it in prior webinars and discussions that yes, while they're all eligible, we know that there are other funding opportunities out there that are more focused on expanding EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment, charging stations by another name, solar, batteries. There are other opportunities to try and find ways to cover that. So again, because this program is so focused on the efficiency basics, first and foremost, while they're eligible, we would encourage communities to try and maximize that part of the work on their buildings and see if they can use other funding opportunities that are available right now. And there are so many. We definitely understand it's hard to keep straight in your head all the different pieces out there, and we appreciate Katie Buckley and the VLCT folks and Jonah Miller and VECAN and these other partners, regional planning commissions, all trying to help make sense of the current funding landscape. So again, just try and let's see if we can prioritize the basics with the available MERP grants, and then find other funding sources where possible to cover charging stations and solar and batteries, things like that. That way you can, and I think this was a key part of the administration's ARPA tours that were conducted over the last year or two around the state, how we can layer in and be a resource to stack together. These, as the Deputy Commissioner mentioned, act as state dollars. You don't have to worry about the standard federal issues. So those are the things that we want to have towns kind of keep in mind when they're looking at how to get all of these priorities tackled.
I see a bunch of questions about procurement. So if you look at the implementation guidance, we spent a lot of time talking about this. Each municipality needs to have a procurement policy or not, right? In theory, generally, and as basic as it is up to the city or the select board to approve purchases. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Buy America rules do not apply to this. It is state-funded dollars, so they do not come into play. So have your own procurement policy, whatever the towns may say. VLCT, and I think the RPCs as well, both have some resources if your town does not otherwise have a procurement policy. BGS is not going to burn into, oh my gosh, that's not our policy, or we're not going to spend any time. If your town's adopted it, we're going to accept that as an adopted procurement policy by the municipality. And it can be pretty basic. It doesn't need to be fancy. Libraries, I don't know. I do know the library program. It's a great program, and we've worked with them, and they've been a friend of ours for this program. I would say that we will probably work with them. If this is a building that is possibly be funded by them, I think it'd be good to note in your narrative. But I would say apply for your buildings as you see them in priority for your community. And then if there is some sort of overlap between us and libraries, we can also have that conversation with Catherine and see how we work through that. But I would say apply for what you guys want to fund, and we'll work it on the back end if there's some kind of overlap between programs. State approved contractor list. This is a great one because we have lots of towns here. BGS, Office of Purchasing and Contracting, we lovingly call OPC. They, in all of our or many of our contracts, and if you go to BGS's website and the Office of Purchasing and Contracting, there is a list, an Excel spreadsheet of many contracts, not just for MERP, but for many things. We talked about this a lot in the disaster side of the world, where towns need things during a disaster. Those contracts are available to any municipality to utilize the state's already procured resources to utilize the rate structure and the agreements that we have in place. And those have all been competitively negotiated and contracted out. So yes, there's a list. I would say that look at that list. There may or may not be the resource you're looking for, but I would also say tag that for your administrators in your towns, because there's a ton of stuff on there that may be relevant outside of just the MERP program. And we really try to get the word out about being able to utilize that by the municipalities. It's probably an underutilized resource right now. Oh, some of these are very specific. I think the specific ones, folks, will kick back over to Brian's group, and they'll come back to you guys with answers on those building specific ones. Perpetually leased buildings. Are you going to need a copy of the lease? We will not need a copy of the lease through the application. I think once we get into the award section, we'll look for some supporting documentation if there's a perpetual lease on file to just ensure that we're all in alignment. So again, leasing is going to be, this application is going to be very quick. We know it's going to be very quick. We're trying to reduce burden. And as we get into the pre-award phase, we'll probably reach back out to people if there's specific, the one-offs like perpetually leased buildings that we want to verify information on. The building needs a new roof before we could put ceiling insulation and MERP fund the roof as well. Again, these are based in the need. So, we talked about this, I think in one of the other RFQ or Q&As that we've had. State the project. If you adding insulation to the ceiling requires structural improvements, that's a project, right? Ideally, we'd like to see as much money go out the door with as much gain, but sometimes it requires, we know this, we do it frequently, right, Brian, in our buildings, that sometimes the changes require more. And that's, again, why we're trying to leave these in budget line items as opposed to give me your quote for more insulation. And then you go to do it out in the field and somebody goes, well, you can't do that. You need more columns, or you need more roof system, or you may need this. So I would say apply for those things. Please tell your story, say what you're doing and what is required. Why is that number so high for weather sealing a 4,000 square foot building? Well, it's because we also need to replace this because it won't do well without a new roof. I would say roofing it needs to be a byproduct of the need of either weather sealing, fuel swapping, etc.
Deputy Commissioner, there are a couple of questions. I'm just wondering if you can speak to, you spoke to this a little bit, but related to, are moderate income towns competitive? So if you can speak to clearly wanting to prioritize high and highest energy burdened, but is it worth it for towns? And how can they case make, especially the other question I have is, again, concerned about the 300 word space constraint in the narrative section. So how do RPCs and towns effectively make their case with such limited space?
That's a great question. So, Brian, as I understand it, attachments can be made to the application, right? That was a big piece of why we went this way.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you don't have enough room in the box, I would recommend attaching a Word document, PDF, whatever you like, into the attachment section as additional information for the committee to review. I would say, as much as we want you to tell your story, if it's 30 pages long and you guys do a heck of a dissertation, it's going to be harder to follow, right? And some of that will get lost in translation. So tell your story, use your words. If you need to put another page or two in there, so be it. And the other part of that was around the moderate towns. Everybody's going to be scored. It is prioritized to highest and high, and the scoring metrics that's outlined in the implementation guidance kind of shows you where that changes your numbers, right? So the high burden and highest burden towns get a little bit of a kick up on their scoring right there. But the rest of them are based in many other factors. And we did see, and I think, alluding to the 2023 study by EVT, towns have changed since 2019. It was just the language that was in the bills, and we're following that as such. So that doesn't necessarily mean the story hasn't changed for different towns. Maybe towns have done a bunch of work since 2019 and they don't have as much need. So yes, they're very competitive. I think you're going to want to tell your story about the project. Why, again, you're asking for solar fields, or you're asking for battery storage, and you're a low input, you're a low impact town, probably not going to get scored very high. Just that's not the purpose of this at its heart. So trying to get the resources to communities that are underserved, have not seen grant funding, or don't have the resources. We're trying to infuse that money in those communities to do the best that we can. So yes, still very competitive. We're very, very excited actually about having more competitiveness. When it was just highest and high, it was probably pretty close to most people getting funded in that situation. And maybe some of those projects weren't going to be as great as a moderate community that really has a need that wasn't shown in the 2019 energy burden report.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. There are also a couple of questions related to sort of the definition of obligation and contractual. My understanding is the funds need to be obligated by December 1, 2024. What does obligate mean? Do we need to have
Yeah.
contracts in hand, or can the
Yeah.
select board allocate the funds and that counts as obligate?
No, we're gonna need, this is fun. So this is where you guys are probably, I would say, like start teeing up your select boards or councils or whatever municipal governance that's overhanging you guys for both the application and then understanding about how the grant agreement gets signed. So we will need an executed grant agreement to show obligation. That is why in the time frame that's otherwise been put out, that's a big number. So when we give you pre-award, the reason for that is, again, it's nice to know, but it's also to try to get you guys geared up to let your city council or select board or whatever your municipality governance is that, hey, we may need a special session. Can you give authority to the energy committee or whoever that person may be to approve the grant agreement once it comes in, because it is going to be fast. So highly recommendation, exclamation point, start working on that in your communities either now and just kind of say, hey, this may happen. We don't know. We're putting the grant in, but we're going to need your support because the turnaround is going to be very fast. There's nothing that BGS can do about that. We are being restricted by those ARPA dates. So the more preparation you can have, the less last minute we're going to see from the communities. Like, hey, my select board only met once in the month of September or October. I can't get there. How do I do that? So I would start that work now, of just understanding what that means for your municipality, because everyone's a little bit different on who can approve a grant agreement.
And just a quick follow-up, a grant agreement finalized, but not necessarily construction contracts.
Yeah, no, executed grant agreement with BGS. That's all we're going to need to show obligation.
Okay, with time ticking down, I'm wondering if people can do me a favor and put a thumbs up next to the 3 questions that you'd like to see answered. I'm going to try and we're going to follow up, but we do want to, there's a lot of questions, trying to sift through them. So if there are key things that we want to make sure while we have the commissioner and deputy commissioner, please clarify obligate. Does this mean a contract with a subcontractor following procurement rules?
No, obligate is a signed grant agreement between the two of us.
Signed grant agreement between the two of us. Okay.
The applicant.
Not the select board signing off. It's between the BGS and the town.
Yes, well, the select board, it depends on your town. If the select board needs to approve, many select boards do need to approve a grant agreement.
So when we say obligated, we're really meaning the state obligating the funding, right? So as soon as we enter into an agreement with a town, we, the state, have now binded ourselves to you, and we're obligating that funding, saying now we have reserved that funding for you. So the obligation is really on our side when we say obligated, but in order for us to have that relationship, right, we need to have an executed grant agreement, right? So that's our obligation together on the project. And then we at the state of Vermont can say we've obligated the money to pick a town, Newport. I'm just throwing that out there.
Okay. Are there ones, Dan, drop them in the chat if you're seeing any thumbs up. If the cost estimate for one recommendation, e.g. insulation, is too high and the cost estimate for another, heat pumps, too low, can the excess funds from the building envelope line item in the grant budget be shifted to a different line? Is there wiggle room if those estimates don't add up?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's a conversation when we get to those places that we're not going to be running and screaming towards the end of this like we're doing right now, unfortunately. And BGS wants to be, with your RPCs, be a partner in those decisions. And I would say the bottom dollar is the bottom dollar. And we want to stick to the lines as much as we can, just because it's much easier on everybody for tracking purposes. But if one line runs high and one runs way under because you guys did a good job finding alternatives, or the local groups really kicked in the butt, just come back to BGS, say, hey, my lines aren't quite right. We'd love to spend this money here. Can we do so? and we'll come up, and we don't have at this very moment. The team's been working very, very hard to change things and make this out the door, but we'll work on an agreement for an amendment showing that change to the line items.
Okay. Going back to the obligated, what goes into that agreement with BGS? Their town's gonna take out a bond for their project, can't reasonably have the vote for the bond until we know if we're eligible for the grant. How do you recommend they proceed?
Yeah, so again, obligate is a signed grant agreement. So if your town, depending on whatever scenario you may have, if BGS comes to you with pre-award and sometime there in October, and you guys want to accept that grant, then we will need your select board or whatever authority to sign off and execute a grant agreement with the state for the project that you have submitted on. How that plays into your big picture, there's lots of pieces there. I'm not going to start into that, but the obligation for the state is an executed grant agreement with the municipality in the state of Vermont. At that point, it's till 2026, right, that we have to kind of get the money to you guys out of our pocket into yours. There is some measure, and if you read the implementation guidance, there's some measuring about how we wrap up a project that may still have some remaining funds left at the end of that performance period. And it doesn't mean the work has to be done. Ideally, we would like to have all the work done by, the last quarter of 2026. There is ways for us to otherwise make sure that you still have the funding in your pocket if the project does exceed past 2026. But again, tell that story about you guys are going for a bond, you're going for this huge project, it's going to be the coolest thing ever, best thing that ever happened to this town. We want to hear about it, but we also want to hear, yeah, but it's also going to take us to 2027 before we have the whole thing built. But this is like a key component. So tell that piece of that to us so that we understand the full picture of what's going on and where the funding is going.
Okay, a little bit relatedly, will towns be required to complete all of the work that they apply for the funding to cover?
No, again, it's budget lines. We know that sometimes budgets are much lower than we would have hoped. Again, if the project substantially changes, and I would say this in any category, right? If the project substantially changes, BGS would like to know. What does substantial mean, Dave? It's going to mean different things to different people. But if it doesn't look, taste, and feel like it did when you applied for it, probably means it's substantially changed. If all of a sudden you ask for 6 windows and now you can't get any of them done, but you want to start putting insulation around your basement, that's a big different change. And I would say that's a substantial change from what was asked for. But if you want to put 12 windows in and ear seal around this little ductwork in the basement we didn't know about, that's not a substantial change to me. That's just using your money as your budget line items are appropriately. If you have questions, I would say that's once we get these grant agreements, like just send them up to BGS. Hey, this is what happened. What can we do? We have staff. The program provided at least 4 staff. We are up to 4 staff. We have 3 on board right now. That's what they're doing is MERP, and then we have all of our RPC friends. So they're here to assist through all of those kind of weird places and things that we have questions on.
Okay. There's money about how the money flows to the town. I think that's been answered. I guess one of the questions I have, just process-wise from the BGS team, there's a request for another webinar. I don't know if you guys are willing and able to do that. We may be able to do that. But process-wise, we're going to capture the chat. We've got a bunch of questions. We'll work with Brian and Grace to follow up and get answers to those questions.
BGS is also going to put a Q&A, Joey, or a FAQ for the ones that we're getting a lot. So we're working on that now. We kind of wanted to have this, right, to get a feeling of what we're seeing a lot and not just RPCs have been great and there's planners and they've got a different look on things. And then we wanted to hear from the applicants on what the questions are really burning in their brain. So FAQ to be coming in the next, I would say, week or so at the latest, out the door. So we'll send that. That'll be posted on the website. Brian, I think you guys typically send that to the serve list that we have for the MERP program when we release new things, and then we'll post it on the website.
Yeah, so please sign up if you haven't, or if you are new to this and just joined your community. Please go to the MERP website, add your email to our listserv so that you'll get those updates when we send them out. And
this importantly, Grace just dropped in the chat a hard copy of like some support filling out the application. So just drawing your attention to that. I can drop it in the chat again. This is a really useful resource. We will send out the recording after this. We will work with the BGS team to make sure that we're sending you the answers to the updated FAQ that they're putting together. We'll capture the chat and send that to BGS, and we can also share it with you all if that's helpful. I think there's some good content in there. Any last minute burning questions or thoughts from the BGS team?
Just to recognize that we know we don't have a very long runway here. We recognize that we're all going to have to move very quickly together. More resources will be needed because we're truncating the timeline. So again, we're going to rely on our program partners as well as ourselves to support all the different communities in submitting their grant applications. Your first stop shop is obviously your regional planning commissions. They are there to provide technical and grant assistance. So please go to them first. But we are here, and there are many other partners that we mentioned. So we're going to do great work. It's really exciting. I know we don't have a lot of time. So do the best job you can. And here's my one message to you that I try to always tell myself, because I try to be an A+ student. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So do the best. We're all just going to do the best job that we can, but don't try to be perfect. Because if we all try to be perfect, right, we would need a lot more time to get all of this work done in a very short time frame. So I want to thank you all, and thank you for being excited about the program. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions today. We will continue to answer those questions over time. If folks would really like another webinar next week and we can work with our program partners to pull that off, we're more than happy to do that.
Indeed. Thank you all. We'll work to get you the questions answered, and as the commissioner said, make this happen for you all, as many people as possible. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. It's Friday.
Thank you. Thank you so
Take care.
much.